Welcome to the podcast. I'm Nick Jackomis, and today I'm speaking with Dr. Christopher Timmermann. Chris received his PhD in neuropsychopharmacology at Imperial College London, where he is currently a postdoctoral scientist at the Center for Psychedelic Research. Chris led the first neuroimaging studies on the effects of the potent tryptamine psychedelic DMT on the brain. He is currently studying the effects of DMT on the brain and human consciousness, as well as its potential clinical applications. Chris and I spent most of our time discussing DMT and related psychedelics, including how DMT is normally consumed in both recreational and laboratory contexts, how people describe its effects and what it actually does subjectively, how it compares to psychedelics like psilocybin and LSD in terms of how it works and what effects it has, and whether DMT is an endogenous compound that's actually present in our own bodies. We also talked about Chris's research, and he described how the effects of DMT on patterns of activity in the brain actually look when you look at the data, and what he hopes to learn from his ongoing research, which includes extending the duration of DMT experiences from just a few minutes, like they normally are, to up to 30 minutes in a single session. As always, if you enjoy the content of this podcast, please like, share, and subscribe. We have both the audio version, available in any podcast directory, and a video version on YouTube. Today's show is brought to you in part by Dosist, an all-natural cannabis company specializing in dose-controlled cannabis products made with plant-based ingredients. To learn more about Dosist, their products, and where they are available, please visit their website through the link in the episode description. With that, here's my conversation with Chris Timmermann. Chris Timmermann, thanks for joining me.
Well, thanks for having me, Nick.
Yeah, glad to have you. Super excited to talk about your work and the world that you live in as a psychedelic researcher. Can you start off by just telling everyone who you are, where you are, and what you do at a high level?
So I'm a postdoc researcher at Imperial College London. Thus, I live in London. We're actually having a very nice, beautiful day here, which is fairly unusual. I work at the Center for Psychedelic Research. I've been there for the past 6 years. That's also where I did my PhD. My research has focused on the effects of DMT in the human brain, the experience induced by DMT on a broad level, and also other aspects related to what you might call psychedelic practice and how to perfect psychedelic practice to a certain extent. Yeah, that's it.
So what's your PhD and what kind of scientist are you?
It's in neuroscience and psychology. I'm a psychologist by training, did a master's in neuroscience, and my PhD was in neuropsychopharmacology.
I see. So you've done a lot of research on DMT. Can we start off by just describing for everyone what is DMT, the molecule? What kind of psychedelic is it? And maybe compare and contrast it a little bit to other psychedelics that people may have heard about, such as psilocybin, say.
DMT is what you might call one of the classic psychedelic compounds. That means that its action is due to a specific agonism at specific receptor in the brain, a serotonin receptor in the brain, the serotonin 2A receptor. And in that way, it has a similar mechanism of action as psilocybin and LSD and also mescaline. It is a naturally occurring psychedelic. It is in many plants and is in many mammals, in the body of many mammals, including the human body. Therefore, it is an endogenous compound. DMT also has a rich historical and cultural use. It is part of the brew ayahuasca used in the Amazon. And it is also part of DMT containing snuffs, which has been used in South America and Central America for hundreds, actually thousands of years, some of the evidence says. And it is particular DMT in that it induces immersive experiences, meaning that it generates visual imagery that tend to surpass in their immersive quality to that of LSD and psilocybin at regular doses. Some of these immersive experiences feature at times feelings of entering a novel dimension, a place that feels more real than this reality, and encountering beings or entities. This is subjective experiences, of course. And in that way, it is a unique psychedelic substance. It can be smoked, usually when it's done recreationally, or in non-controlled lab environments. People smoke DMT, which tends to give a very short but intense trip. So people are going into these other novel places, coming in and out of them in a matter of minutes.
So it's a classical psychedelic drug, similar in some ways to things like psilocybin. It's interacting with the classic, what people often call the psychedelic receptor in the brain, the serotonin 2A receptor, but it's very different in some ways. So it's this immersive, very visual experience, as you described. It's very intense, but short acting. What accounts for that difference between something like DMT and something like psilocybin, where you're talking about minutes of an experience that's very intense, as opposed to hours of something that's intense, but not completely immersive in the way that DMT is?
Well, the main difference is that it's degraded in the body in a very fast fashion. So we have essentially an enzyme in our bodies that degrades DMT, metabolizes it quite fast. And maybe that's why our DMT levels are always kept in check, our endogenous DMT levels, because of this enzyme. That doesn't happen with psilocybin or LSD. That is why also DMT is not active when taken orally, when it's eaten. And that's why for ayahuasca, you need a combination of DMT containing plants and the beta-carbolane containing plants, like the actual ayahuasca vine, that inhibits the destruction of DMT by this enzyme and extends the effects of DMT in time.
So that enzyme that breaks down DMT rapidly, monoamine oxidase, is that happening rapidly with DMT essentially because it's so chemically similar to serotonin, so that we basically already have the enzymatic machinery to break it down because of that similarity?
You could say that, yeah. It's a reasonable assumption. I'm not sure if that's exactly the reason why, but it seems like DMT, because it's an endogenous compound, we have homeostatic mechanisms, being the mechanisms that keep the balances and the chemicals in our bodies in check. And this enzyme provides that opportunity, essentially, by keeping DMT levels down.
And there's two versions of DMT that people sometimes mention. There's DMT, which is most of what this discussion will focus on. And then there's something called 5-MeO DMT. Can you briefly just describe the difference between those two compounds?
Sure. So both of them are naturally occurring, NN-DMT and 5-methoxy or 5-MeO DMT. DMT tends to occur and can be extracted from plants, NN-DMT, while 5-MeO DMT is primarily found at reasonable doses or psychoactive doses in the venom of the Bufo alvarius toad, it's a northern Mexican toad. In terms of the kind of effects it produces, they're both short-acting. 5-methoxy DMT, when smoked, is a bit more prolonged, some say. And the quality of the experience is different, at least from what we know from anecdotal reports. So NN-DMT induces this very rich, content-filled experience. You're seeing a lot of objects. People are engaging with these objects, these entities, these beings, these feelings of inhabiting different places. It's a rich experience. With 5-MeO DMT, people appear to have a very radical sense of ego dissolution, meaning that the subject-object distinction, which we carry in the world, usually completely dissolves away. And it can be quite extreme, to the point that when people are having that experience, many times they feel that they're experiencing their own deaths. And it seems to provide an experience in which people are no longer having any sort of reliable content, but having just an experience of a white light, and an experience of somehow having an experience of everything and nothing at the same time, which is not necessarily something hard to get your head around when you're just hearing that. So it says that it induces this very strong ego dissolution experience. So the contrast between DMT and 5-MeO DMT is, while both of them are fast acting, one has a lot to do with characters and contents that people experience and an immersed relationship with that content. Whereas in 5-MeO DMT, it's a massive sort of ego dissolving experience in which people reach to a point in which they no longer experience any content whatsoever, and they just have this experience of the white light.
Mm-hmm. So DMT, in terms of its subjective effects, is reported to be very rich in content, as you say. People literally see stuff. It's very immersive. I've heard it described as almost like an extremely compelling and extremely bizarre virtual reality experience. Can you talk a little bit more about the common threads that come out of people's reports of the subjective effects, just so that we can sort of paint a picture to the best of our ability of what the subjective effects are for people that haven't experienced it? And I want to do that before we get into brain stuff. So it's very fast acting. There's lots of content. It's very compelling content, whatever exactly that means. And there's a lot going on in the DMT experience. Are there any common themes to the visual aspects of the subjective experience that tend to come out in reports?
What we found in our research is that the experience, you can think of experience from a structural perspective or a content perspective. From a structural perspective, we mapped out that this experience has it involves the body, the visual sort of perception, and emotional contents. Broadly speaking, these are the three main structural domains that are affected. What we find that it's a reliable aspect of the experience when we give it intravenously is that people have this, at the beginning of the experience, a strong sense of energy, bodily rush happening in their bodies. Many people who have other sort of experiences with yoga and Kundalini and things of the sort liken it to a form of Kundalini sort of rush awakening, an energy transversing the body that has carries a sense of edge and a sense of also deep meaning. After that, people have this immersive visual quality experience. So they go through what some people call this breakthrough DMT experience, which they're no longer seeing some geometrical patterns, which you encounter with other sort of psychedelic drugs, but they're now breaking through into what seems like different reality or dimension. This is when you give high enough doses to people. And while they're having this experience of breaking through into this different sort of realm, at the same time, the body kind of goes away into the background. People, while at the beginning had this strong sense of rush in their body, no longer feel their body's present. Some people feel they're having an out-of-body sort of experience, not necessarily looking into their bodies, but in a way feeling that their experience is no longer anchored to their body state. Which, when you think about it, is curiously similar to the experience of dreaming. You're having a very visually engaging experience that can have a fantastical character to it, but you're no longer attached to your body. and your environmental signals. So it's a virtual reality experience. And then after this strong sort of breaking through into the space subsides after a couple of minutes, people start coming back and making sense of what happened, integrating the experience, if you will. And in that integration, emotional content starts to arise. Kind of like taking in the messages that they got from that experience and how it reflects in their relationships, in their own lives, in their notions of spirituality, in their notions of reality sometimes, etc. So these are some of the features. And another, I think, within that, I kind of mentioned it, is that when people have high enough doses of NN-DMT, they can have what is this called sometimes as this ontological shock reaction or experience, that the experience feels more real than real. It seems to carry some sort of authority in terms of the contents that it's providing, the teaching, and that has something to do with the nature of reality. And that can change people's worldviews as well in a significant fashion after the fact.
Do people, when they have a DMT experience under controlled conditions, do they normally look back on it in a positive light, in a negative light, a mix of both? Is there any commonality to whether or not people are evaluating the experience as a good one, a bad one, or neutral?
It depends very much on what we call the setting, the intention people might have, and so on. How well they are prepared psychologically to have that experience. In the context of ayahuasca, DMT is a big part of ayahuasca. It's not the whole thing, but it is a big part of that. In the context of ayahuasca, many people find a lot of meaningful experiences in that. And the setting of ayahuasca can be a culturally rich setting. There's a lot of songs, there's rituals, and it's also a longer experience. And a lot of people find a positive effect out of that experience. With DMT, when it's given on its own, let's say in a lab setting, like you said, injected, the experience can be very fast and can be a bit overwhelming. So again, depending on the level of preparation that the person has, that can be a satisfying experience. Some people can find it even pleasurable, like in terms of a sensual sort of pleasure that they get out of the experience. Many times we've seen that people provide a very strong sense of aesthetics, a sense of beauty, of appreciating the beauty of the experience in a way that they hadn't done so for many times, for a long time before that. So just the experience of beauty as having an inherently healing quality to some extent. Just a thing that doesn't get talked to very much, which I find particularly interesting. And sometimes challenging experiences. So sometimes people can have overwhelming experiences in which they struggle. It's not that they struggle with the experience in terms of how did this fit, but it can be scary. The encounters with beings can provide a sense of realness that is a bit sometimes overwhelming for the person. Nonetheless, also in some of those occasions, those challenging experiences can be fruitful for the person if it's somehow dealt in the right way. But yeah, it's varied for sure, and very much depending on the level of readiness that the person has.
Mm-hmm. A little bit later, I want to circle back to some of this stuff and at least attempt to think about it from a neuroscientist perspective in terms of what might be going on in the brain that gives rise to these types of experiences. But you mentioned something that people often report for DMT, which is that it's a threshold drug. There's very strong dose-dependent effects, and at some point, the dose gets strong enough that there's a shift in the intensity of the experience, what people call that breakthrough experience. So when you're giving DMT in the lab intravenously, what doses are we talking about here in milligrams for like a normal sized adult? Are we talking about ones of milligrams, tens of milligrams? What is a low dose and what is a high dose that would get you past that threshold?
So 7 milligram of DMT in salt form, so DMT fumarate, it's a low dose, usually provides these experiences of geometrical patterns only. There can be emotional content, but it's more an interplay of what the person carries to that session and these geometrical patterns that form. At 14 milligrams, we consider that a medium dose. It can have an immersive quality. People are on the verge of that threshold, but still not beyond it, if you will. And at 20 milligrams is where we found a medium to high breakthrough dose that maintained a good balance between safety and still being quite immersive. I mean, we gave that dose to many people in the fMRI scanner, and we asked for people for intensity ratings while the experience is happening. And for some people, they weren't able to give ratings. So definitely breakthrough for many, many people, to the point that they're no longer attentive to, what's happening around them.
So when you have that breakthrough experience at those higher doses, it is truly immersive in the sense that you can really no longer engage with someone in the room with you.
Yeah.
And you've mentioned already something that also comes up a lot with DMT, which is that it's an endogenous compound. So it's found both in the plant world and in the animal world, apparently, inside of organisms. So starting with plants, can you speak a little bit about how common DMT is in the plant world? What types of plants is it found in? And maybe, if it's really known, whether or not we figured out the physiological role that DMT might be serving for the plants.
That's all good questions. I don't have answers for all of them. So the use of DMT, the DMT can be found in many, many different plants. There's some studies saying that it's almost like the statement is like DMT is kind of everywhere in plants. I mean, it shows up in many, many different plants. Not entirely sure what proportion of plants, to be honest. But it is something that it is found in, for example, acacia trees, which are incredibly common in most parts of the world. It is found in the seeds of the Anaderantera tree, which is very prominent in South America. So when used as enough, DMT is, the seeds are smashed and made into powder. So fairly accessible and fairly common. Now, not all the plants carry the same amount of DMT, and some are better at providing that. In the Amazon, you find it in the Psychotria viridis bush. And again, for it to have a reliable effect in the plant world, it needs to be either smoked or taken in conjunction with a MAO inhibitor, as you mentioned before, so that this enzyme in the gut doesn't destroy DMT. As for the role in plants, we don't know. We don't know what the role of DMT is in plants.
Yeah, that's my understanding as well, that for DMT specifically, a physiological function for plants hasn't been worked out. But what's always struck me about DMT and other psychoactives, so everything from caffeine to THC, is you often find these things concentrated in parts of the plant, like sometimes the leaves or the bark or the root bark, usually parts of the plant that touch the outside world. And for other psychoactives, at least, there's some evidence to suggest that these things are generally playing a defensive role. So they're basically preventing insects or other things from eating the plant. And so I wonder, I would speculate that maybe DMT is doing something like that, but I don't think I don't even know how you would exactly study that. But it's always been interesting to me that it's concentrated in certain parts of the plant. So what's arguably more interesting that I get asked about more is endogenous DMT in animals, including humans. And my understanding here is that it is found endogenously, but there's perhaps some conflicting information out there about how prominent it is in our tissues, which tissues it's actually found in, and whether or not there's any known endogenous function in animals. So can you talk about where people have actually detected DMT inside animal and human tissues?
So as far as I understand, they've detected the precursor of DMT very prominently featured in the lungs. And they've investigated as well in the rat's brain, and they found also DMT in the rat brain. And they've also seen it in human cerebrospinal fluid, so if you will, brain juice. That's also where DMT has been shown up. And based on that sort of set of circumstances, it has been argued that DMT is somehow present in the human brain, and also, and more directly, in the rodent's brain. I mean, that has been definitely established. There was a theory by Rick Strassman, who did amazing work with DMT in the 1990s, that DMT was produced by the pineal gland. Now, they found that in rodents that without a pineal gland, they found also still that there was DMT in the brain at an important level. So therefore, we now know that the pineal gland is not a necessary sort of organ for the production of DMT.
And when they detect DMT in rat brains, for example, what levels are we talking about here? Is this tiny, tiny levels that suggest that maybe it's just a kind of metabolic byproduct? Or is it at levels high enough where it could, in theory, be doing something biologically relevant?
So that is an ongoing discussion, and experiments are happening to determine that. So at the University of Michigan, they recently published a paper in which they found increased levels of NN-DMT in the rat's brain. And what I've seen from that paper is that levels are fairly comparable to serotonin, which is one of the major neurotransmitters in the human brain. That, however, has been debated. The exact technicalities of that debate, I'm not entirely sure. But there's technical arguments on how it's been measured and where it's been measured, and whether or not that tells us something about the physiological function of NN-DMT in the mammalian brain.
I see. So tell me if this is accurate. It sounds like people have looked for and found DMT in the rat brain. It's definitely there. It's been claimed to be at levels that are high enough where it could be something, something that's playing a biological function, but it's debated. And in humans, we know that it's probably in the nervous system, at least at small levels, because you can find it in cerebrospinal fluid and things like this, but it has not been directly measured at what we would call significant levels in the human brain at this time.
Exactly.
Okay. So turning a little bit more to DMT in the brain, and then eventually getting to some of your work, Before we get there, I want to talk about the history of DMT research, or if there really is much history there. So for things like LSD, I think a lot of people know that there's actually a lot of research done decades and decades ago in the mid 20th century, and then based on the way things worked out in the US and elsewhere, that research sort of went away, and now we're seeing this kind of resurgence. But there was this somewhat rich literature for some psychedelics going back decades and decades. Prior to your research in the last 5 to 10 years, say, was there much research that had been done with DMT? Had anything been studied historically in terms of DMT and its effects in the brain?
Well, DMT itself, there has been research. It is similar to the other psychedelics in terms of it had its heyday in the 50s and 60s and even 70s a bit, DMT. And then it went underground for a couple of decades. I guess the early tracings of DMT research can be found in ethnobotany and anthropology work with ayahuasca. So in the mid 19th century, Richard Spruce was the first one to describe the effects of ayahuasca. Therefore, it plays a crucial role in the story of DMT. Then you have the example of Richard Evans Schultz, which is a famous ethnobotanist, also describing some of the effects of DMT. But I think it really came into strong prominence with the Beat Generation. So William Burroughs, I don't know if you know the story of William Burroughs and this story. He accidentally shot his wife, and while he was drunk playing this game, like this crazy kind of dark story, the Beat Generation, and he went to the Amazon to somehow looking for a cure for his torment that he was having. And he found ayahuasca, actually yaje, the Colombian version of the Amazon in ayahuasca, and he wrote these yaje letters to Allen Ginsberg. And it is very curious in a way because he kind of stumbled upon DMT or ayahuasca, and is one of the first people to do so. So super interesting. And I'd say contemporary to that, the first modern researcher to study DMT, the effects of DMT, is Stephen Sara. He's a Hungarian biochemist in the 50s who wanted to study LSD. He was extremely interested in all this work that was coming out in the 50s with this compound. But because he was Hungarian, he was, behind the Iron Curtain. Sandoz, the pharmaceutical company that manufactured LSD, denied him access to it. So therefore, he was looking for alternatives. He read some of these interesting reports about this nuts that contain DMT in the Amazon, and he synthesized it himself, and he intramuscularly injected DMT at different doses until he finally found something. And he did a lot of experiments. He did experiments also some with a lot of ethically questionable experiments in which he gave DMT to patients with schizophrenia. He did some EEG work with DMT, so measuring electrodes in the brain, seeing what happens once you gave DMT. And he did a lot of research into that. And after that, there was almost no research with psychedelics, including DMT. And in the 1990s, Rick Strassman in the US, the first US researcher to study psychedelics after the Prohibition time, he did his first experiments with DMT, with the argument that DMT is very short. It's a short-acting drug, therefore it's very safe. It has a good safety profile. And he did this very interesting experiments with human beings in which he intravenously injected DMT to them and characterized their effects. He wrote a book about it called DMT, the Spirit Molecule, and there's also a film about it, and in it you can see the participants of that study telling their story. And after that, there's been virtually no work with DMT until our studies in the past 5 years. There's a single exception with a German group who actually gave it a shot at giving DMT continuously, which is something that we're doing now as well.
Giving it continuously, is that what you said?
Yeah.
So for an extended period of time, like more than a few minutes.
Exactly. So DMT, the extension of the DMT state. Yeah.
So before we get there, one more background question I want to ask, and it has to do with like the toxicology of this. So you mentioned Strassman's argument that because it's short acting, it probably has a good safety profile. Has that been fully worked out? What is the toxicology of DMT? Does it cause any toxic effects that have been measured?
At normal, reasonable doses, no toxic effects have been found. So similar to LSD, although not as good as LSD. I mean, the safety profile of LSD is excellent. But with DMT, it has a very good safety profile as well, especially considering that it's also an endogenous compound. It's inner body. Our bodies somehow know how to deal with DMT, if you will.
I see. So a little bit of research done in the 50s era. Then there's a break, and then you have people like Strassman in the 90s studying it, and then there's another break where there's basically very little happening. And then we get to you. So before you actually describe your research, what actually drew you to DMT as the object of your scientific study, and why did you choose to work on DMT as opposed to psilocybin or something else?
Well, DMT was particularly attractive because it induced this very strange experiences, this very unique experiences. What we were talking about before, this feeling of breaking through into a different dimension, a different reality, with this ontological shock experience that somehow you're being taught something relating the nature of reality. I thought that those were very interesting things that no work was being done in terms of how it relates to the human brain. So when you're trying to understand mechanisms of experience, the brain is a good place to look at as well. And on the consciousness research side of things, I thought it was particularly good, an interesting substance, because of the fact that it is immersive and short acting. You can see if you have a good brain imaging method like fMRI or like EEG, you can look at how that organism goes into that state and then goes out of it, right? So you can think of a DMT experience as building a reality, building this other dimension. What are the brain mechanisms that allow this feeling of generating a whole different reality? And then what are the mechanisms that change when you go back into your normal sort of state?
So the fact that it's intense and short acting makes it easier to actually watch the brain as you go into that state, but then come back out of it.
Exactly. It's like it's a way, if you will, to compress a psychedelic experience in a very intense fashion in a short amount of time and map out what's happened.
Mm-hmm. So can you talk a little bit about some of the research that you've done the past 2 years? What exactly did you do, and how did you guys do it? So when you talk about things like EEG, for example, let's try and explain for people who don't know what that is, how that works at a very basic level.
Sure. So we're on our third study now with DMT. My first DMT study was, as you say, an EEG study. EEG stands for electroencephalogram. So it picks up electrical activity in the scalp. So these caps that have electrodes, and the electrodes capture the actual electrical activity of neurons firing, right? So these neurons, when they fire, they generate an electrical current, which is picked up by these sensors. And this gives you these electrical patterns are then mapped out into different frequencies or different brain waves. And this is when people speak about delta waves, theta waves, alpha waves, gamma waves, and so on. So we did our first study on that. We also tested different doses to see, what would be a safe dose to give to people in our next stage. And our next stage was in the scanner. So we did the same thing. We gave people this dose of DMT while they were in the scanner. We actually did it twice for each person. And what we're doing now is our continuous infusion DMT experiments, which is being done by my PhD student as well, Lisa Luan, which we're trying to extend this state in time. And in all of these studies, we are looking at the brain, but also having a very close look at the experience. So we're trying to also use discipline methods to understand these experiences. The question of the issue with DMT and psychedelics is that they're very prone to interpretation by the set and setting. So the cultural frameworks people have to understand these experiences and how they make meaning out of it, it influences how they report on it. So what we're trying to do is approach the experience also from a scientific and disciplined manner, and we can have an appropriate level of the description of that, so that we can then marry that with brain activity.
So you're using things like EEG and fMRI. For people that are unfamiliar, these are non-invasive techniques. So nothing's going into anyone. With EEG, is it safe to say that people are sort of wearing almost like a hairnet that you would wear at night or in the shower, but it's just hooked up to wires, and this apparatus is detecting? How would you describe exactly what it's detecting? So it's detecting large scale sort of global brain activity, and we can think about that as waves that have different frequencies, almost like if you were looking at the ocean or something. There's big waves that kind of roll in, and then there's little tiny choppy waves riding on top of that. Is that a fair description of how EEG works?
That's a very good description of how EEG works. Yeah, you have patches of neuron. When they're working in sync, you can detect these brainwave patterns, essentially. Yeah.
And then how is that different from the fMRI scanner that someone physically goes inside of? What do those two things show you? How are they different in terms of what they're actually picking up?
fMRI is, again, as you say, a non-invasive technique to determine brain activity. It measures metabolism in the brain, the consumption of energy in the brain. That is what you're seeing. And it's picked up by magnets, this massive magnets in the scanner, and very complicated physics. That's how it works. And what fMRI provides as a measurement, it gives you very good spatial resolution. So as opposed to, as you said, in EEG, you have this large scale activity which comes up in the form of waves. In fMRI, you can actually look at the metabolism of little bits in the brain. So it's almost like you can slice the brain in very little cubes, which we call voxels, and we can infer brain activity from the activation patterns that we see at each of these little voxels or cubes. From that, we can then determine how networks are operating, specific brain networks, how strongly they're connected, how hyper-connected different brain regions are with the rest of the brain, for example.
Mm-hmm. So I'm trying to imagine the setup here. You've either got a hairnet on, something that looks like a hairnet for EEG. For fMRI, you're physically going into one of those big scanners that people may have seen on TV, and you've got an IV in your arm or somewhere that is allowing you guys to administer intravenous DMT. One final question before we get to your description of like what's going on in the brain. Not a technical question, but almost. I can't help myself. How much are people moving their body and especially their eyeballs when you give them DMT, and is that impacting how you can interpret these data?
Moving their bodies, it varies. Some people are movers, other people are non-movers. Usually it's undesirable that people move during an fMRI scan. Is what you might call an artifact. It introduces noise not related to brain activity in the measurements. The idea is that inside of the scanner bore, your head needs to be pretty fixed. So it's variable. People move more than usual, for sure, tend to move more than usual. And if people move too much, then we cannot have them in our analysis. Unfortunately, that's how it works. And the eye rolling thing is not so much of an issue. We cannot detect it directly, the eye rolls, because we don't have a specific, device measuring that in the fMRI scanner. But with EEG, we can somehow infer it from specific electrodes which are on top of the brain. So that when the eyes are moving, they generate also an electrical current which is picked up by these electrodes.
I see. So you do the studies, you make the measurements. How would you summarize what you guys generally see in terms of what's going on in the brain when you're going into, when you're immersed in, and then when you're coming out of a DMT experience?
We see the brain in terms of brain waves, big waves, little and fast waves. We see the brain in terms of connectivity, how strongly different networks are connected, or how different parts of the brain are hyperconnected, what we'll call global connectivity. And we see things in terms of entropy, or chaos. So we're able to determine whether or not the brain is acting in a more chaotic fashion or in a more orderly fashion at different time points in different parts of this experience.
And so what does the brain look like in terms of its global patterns in the middle of a DMT experience compared to just a resting sober state?
What we're seeing is that in terms of brain waves, the DMT approximates more a dreamlike state. So in the dreamlike state, there's these low frequencies, this slow, big, fat waves. The delta and the theta waves, they dominate more that experience. We see the similar thing, very similar thing happening with DMT. It's only when people are very immersed in this experience where these low, big waves start to dominate. So that's an intriguing finding somehow, that there's a correspondence between the dream state and the DMT state, and we can pick that up in the brain, and it also, from the experience, it makes sense somehow, this virtual reality kind of experience. We also see that the brain becomes hyper-connected, very globally connected, and that the regions of the brain that becomes globally connected more strongly have to do with those areas which have evolved later for humans. So the neocortex, the prefrontal areas of the brain, and also language-related systems in the brain, the systems that generate meaning, those become hyper-connected. And in terms of entropy or chaos, we see that the brain becomes more chaotic, more disordered. There's a larger repertoire available for brain states now that weren't available before.
I see. So out of all of the possible patterns of brain activity that might be available to the brain at any given moment, you tend to see a wider range of those that become present when someone is on DMT compared to when they're just resting at baseline. And you've done some research where you talk about this idea of top-down versus bottom-up activity in the brain and how DMT affects that. Can you explain for everyone what that is and then what DMT does to those two types of information flow in the brain?
Sure. So this is a way to look at the brain from current neuroscience understanding. So the idea is that the brain operates as a predictive machine. So as a way to save energy, so as an economical fashion, as opposed to the brain just being, if you will, a mirror of external reality, just having all this sensory input being processed into this input-output machine, the idea would be that the brain would be actively predicting reality, would be actively generating models of the world. And then energy is mostly spent or is now allocated for whenever there are disruptions of those models, of those predictions. This is what we call predictive processing. It's a very attractive theory right now in the neuroscience of how the world operates and how we engage with reality or with the environment from moment to moment. So these predictions, these models, is what we call top-down activity. And these disruptions of the prediction, the moments in which we learn, is what we call bottom-up activity. Top-down activity, the models dominate our experience. This is what refers to when some neuroscientists say that our experience of reality is a controlled hallucination. We're always predicting our activity. Our experience is dominated by models rather than by external sensory input. So the idea would be that these top-down models, these predictions, they dominate our everyday experience. Under DMT, these top-down models, which we pick up through traveling waves, backward traveling waves from the front of the brain to the back of the brain, gets very massively disrupted. And instead, bottom-up activity, so these kind of like novel disruptions, these learning opportunities, now come to dominate the way that the brain operates. And we capture these bottom-up activity via forward cortical traveling waves.
And how does that compare? So when people say that DMT is very visual and that you see things that are very vivid, on the one hand, people are just giving you a direct report of what they see, apparently, but because you're talking about the subjective effects someone's having, there's always sort of a gap there. You can't go in and directly read out what they're seeing. You just have to rely on the reports. So you guys have compared what you see in brain activity of people that have taken DMT to what you see in brain activity when they're awake and they're sober and they're looking at something. So in what sense would you describe whether or not people are actually having those very visual experiences on DMT? Does it look like the way the brain looks when you're actually looking at things?
Yeah, exactly. It does, at least from this comparative fashion. So essentially, we saw that these cortical traveling waves, these signals of top-down and bottom-up activity, the way that they change, meaning that these top-down models get disrupted and this bottom-up activity gets pronounced, is the same kind of change that happens when people are actively looking at photic stimulation, so light stimulation in the eyes that wasn't there before. The difference is that in the case of DMT, people have their eyes closed. We're even having them with eye masks when they're having their experience. But nonetheless, they're having this very vivid sort of experience. And we're seeing that the mechanisms driving that visual experience are probably very much related to these traveling waves, changing top-down models and bottom-up activity in a similar way as it happens when people are looking at flashing lights, photic stimulation.
So in the experiments that you've done, where you're using EEG or fMRI to look at the brain when someone has taken DMT, can you compare and contrast what you see in those experiments to what others have seen when they give someone something like LSD or psilocybin? Are there any, when someone is on any of these classic psychedelics, DMT, psilocybin, LSD, or whatever, are there any themes that emerge, similar types of brain activity that you tend to see across experiments? And then the flip side being, what are the differences in terms of the patterns?
So the similarities between all of these compounds, so far it seems that the brain is that there's hyperconnectivity patterns emerging, especially in this evolved part of the brain. So the neocortex, the front part of the brain. Parts of the brain which are related to decision making, which are related to attentional resources, which are related also to our imaginative capacities, the abilities that we human beings have to build new worlds, to build meaning out of things, to develop tools. Those areas become hyper-connected. And that appears to be somewhat consistent between DMT, LSD, and psilocybin. What seems to be different and unique about DMT is that the brain, these brainwave patterns operate somewhat differently. The big difference is that when people have regular LSD and psilocybin doses, all these brainwave patterns go down. There's like the brainwaves become flat, if you will, most of them. Whereas with DMT, we find that these lower frequencies, this delta and these theta waves, they go up. And that's very similar to what happens during dreaming as well. And that seems to be setting apart DMT from LSD and psilocybin. And when you look at the experiences, the phenomenology, if you want to call it like that, to these different substances, what makes DMT unique is exactly this immersive capacity, this feeling that people have that they're entering a novel dimension, entering an sort of like a new reality of sorts.
And so you mentioned before that some of the ongoing research you're doing has to do with these extended DMT experiences. So can you walk people through what kind of questions you're asking for those? And when you say an extended experience, how extended are we talking about?
So we're extending that state for 30 minutes at the time. So we're giving what you call a bolus, so the initial push that we give it in other studies. Mm-hmm. And then 1 minute after that, we maintain a steady state throughout 30 minutes.
And what is the dose that you're targeting for that?
We're using very similar doses to the one that I mentioned before. So something in low threshold, a mid threshold, and in a high threshold. And we're figuring out those doses as we're going along with the study. Mm-hmm. In a safe fashion.
And before we get to the scientific questions that you're exploring, I feel like I have to ask, how are you recruiting people for this? And what kind of people are volunteering for the 30-minute DMT fMRI scan?
Well, a lot of volunteers. People are really excited about this research. A lot of people have been very generous, wanting to provide their time and being very courageous as well, trying to be a part of it. We have word of mouth recruitment. Mm-hmm. So when people know about our studies, they contact us, and if it's feasible and accessible and interesting, then we could recruit them. We have also interested scientists who want to be part of the process sometimes. But really, it's a very varied group.
And how many people are we talking about for these studies? Is it a handful? Is it dozens?
For this one, we're projecting, I think, 30. Yeah, we have 30 in our maximum. So we're aiming for 30 people. A group of them have repeated doses of DMT.
And what are the basic questions that you're hoping to answer with the current research?
We're trying to, if you will, develop a technology. We're trying to figure out whether or not you can extend DMT and if that extension is reliable. We're trying to understand to extend that state so that people can take more out of that experience, understand it better, and then report back to us what's actually going on. We're trying to determine the nature of these entity experience, trying to understand what are their structural features. We're trying to understand if they always have this sort of like extraordinary quality to them, or can these entity experiences be somewhat more commonsensical, if you will, more of the common world. We're trying to see if this immersive quality persists over time, or does it come in waves as other psychedelics. We're trying to understand all these things, but we're doing that while we're capturing high density EEG activity. So we're now wearing a very techy cap with hundreds of electrodes, and that will give us a very nice understanding of where exactly things are happening in the brain, what are the specific areas that are being disrupted, and how this compares to the kind of experiences people are having.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting to think about the fact that DMT is degraded so quickly by our bodies, and therefore that the experience is so short. There's almost perhaps no chance for the brain to adapt to the experience. And I can imagine that certainly one possibility would be that in a 30-minute DMT administration, where you have continuous intravenous DMT, perhaps there is some sort of wave-like quality to it, where the networks in the brain that are changed in response to DMT are then they have enough time to sort of adapt and rebound in some way. And so that would, if that was true, then I suspect that in a 30-minute experience, you would not simply have one uniform 30-minute DMT trip, but somehow it would change over the course of that 30 minutes.
Yeah, this is one of the things that we were trying to figure out, whether or not it is really a fixed thing, or is it a wavy thing, or it's an interesting challenge for the organism to be in that state for such a long time.
And one of the things I do want to ask about too is it has to do with the potential therapeutic applications for DMT in particular, but also in comparison to other psychedelics. And one of the things I want to explore is there are some healthy tensions in the research world about what we want and what we don't want, or what might be useful and not useful in terms of the therapeutic effects of psychedelics. One of those tensions is prolonged experience versus short experience. And you sort of implied by what you said that, on the one hand, people would say the prolonged experience you get with something like psilocybin, or especially LSD, is obviously a very powerful experience, and that's been documented, that's been studied, but it's also inconvenient in many ways, right? It's not easy to scale up the administration of something that, requires a 10-hour supervised trip to get some potential therapeutic benefits. So there's a lot of interest in compressing down that time, and conveniently, perhaps something like DMT has this natural short duration. And yet the flip side of that, as you alluded, is that these short but intense DMT experiences are hard for people to grok. They come back and they have a hard time remembering what happened. They have a hard time, taking any lessons or potential therapeutic benefit out of that. And so you're almost going in the opposite direction and extending the short duration experience a little bit. Do you think there's a happy medium there? And then the other thing I want to touch on that I think is hard to disentangle from that is the psychedelic experience per se, the perceptual distortions and the hallucinatory component of this. There's a lot of effort happening right now around essentially engineering non-psychedelic psychedelics, with the idea being that we can extract most or all of the therapeutic benefit, but actually get rid of the actual psychedelic effects. Can you sort of talk about your view on those things?
Yeah. Well, I think that there's inherent value in long experiences on their own. I don't know if for every sort of condition or every sort of human need related to psychedelics, those long experiences are relevant. I think that indeed the short-acting psychedelics provide an opportunity to somehow have variable opportunities for variable needs in psychiatry and in mental health and in well-being and human development. And I think, different things might help for different people. I find it interesting to explore a middle ground, extending that short experience, because one, it seems that the short DMT experience is not sufficient for the main sort of mental health conditions we're interested, like, for example, depression. You do need to be there a bit longer. As you alluded on your second comment, a lot of the evidence suggests that it is the quality of the experience, so the degree to which people have these mystical type experiences, which predicts the therapeutic outcomes. Therefore, having a sufficiently long experience in which people are able to have the experience and at the same time make meaning out of it while it is happening appears to be a very fundamental and crucial mechanism for this to work. Therefore, a sufficiently long experience might be needed, and DMT might be too short for a mass sort of administration of this, mass administration in clinical settings, if you will. Mm-hmm. So I think that's one element. The other element, which I find particularly relevant, is that we're entering a world of personalized medicine more and more. So one size fits all kind of approach no longer works. The human mind is very complex and is very much determined by the unique history of those individuals and their unique genetics, genetical makeup. I imagine the possibility in which, if we are able to extend that DMT state and develop its come up, the steepness of the come up, if you will, the depth of that come up, and the duration of that plateau, and then the way that it comes down according to those individual needs, then we have a very powerful tool in our hands, something that is able to adapt to the needs of the specific individual. Again, not just necessarily for a medical condition, it could be also part of well-being or human development more broadly. I
actually never thought about that. So with something like psilocybin, you hear all of these powerful stories. One of my last podcast episodes was with this guy named John Kostakopoulos, who described his psilocybin experiences in a clinical trial. But these last for hours, and there's no off switch, right? The doctor can't truncate the experience. But what you're essentially describing with DMT is, if you can extend the experience, you can also turn it off. So at any point, you could simply stop giving it IV, and you could almost have I think what you're saying is you could almost have like a personalized experience where if you understand what's going on sufficiently well, you could prolong or truncate the experience based on what you're reading out from the person, whether or not they need to keep going or not.
Exactly. I mean, that's a good example of how personalized, it could work. So yeah, I mean, it's incredibly exciting for that reason as well. The idea of personalizing a dose, personalizing an experience. It's interesting because, probably you've heard of this, like set and setting is a major feature of psychedelic experiences. How the context and our personal histories influence. But the full story is setting, and dose, setting, and substance itself. There's a pharmacological part of the story which is also fundamental, which is also crucial. There's been studies showing that it's actually dose, the one that can better predict the outcomes rather than any other set and setting variable. So although set and setting is fundamental and very important, perfecting the administration is a big part of the story. And and that's part of what we're trying to do. And finally, to talk to your other question on whether or not these subjective effects are necessary for these therapeutic outcomes. The idea that there's this idea of trying to figure out if you take the psychedelic component out of psychedelics, weirdly enough, is able to have a therapeutic benefit. I am of the thinking, based on the evidence, that it is needed, that the psychedelic effects are needed for therapeutic action. And this has been a finding that has been replicated by a few labs already in a few different studies, with depression, with tobacco addiction, with anxiety related to terminal illnesses. It is these mystical type experiences, this emotional breakthrough experiences, which appear to very strongly predict the positive therapeutic outcomes.
I see. So you're saying that in some of the studies that are out there with psilocybin, for example, the strength of the effect in terms of its effect on, whether it's end-of-life anxiety or depression or addiction, correlates very strongly with the intensity of the actual psychedelic experience.
Yeah, so the therapeutic effects, right? So the efficacy, if you will, is related to the strength of the subjective experiences people have. That being said, I find it a very interesting scientific challenge to figure out what are the kind of changes that would happen in the system without these psychedelic effects. So, for example, if there's plasticity being induced, what does it mean? How can we think of something therapeutic that is not inducing plasticity, or induces plasticity, but it's not working with the subjective effects? And again, this is my feeling is that experience serves as a way to direct plasticity. So you have a substance that is able to generate this brain plasticity mechanism, so the ability for the change to have a transformational effect. But the direction of that transformational effect is mediated by experience, is mediated by set and setting. That's my intuition.
Yeah, so I pretty much share that intuition, and I think the idea here is the word plasticity is often used in a sort of vague way, and it's often used as if it's like plasticity is good, like inherently good. But plasticity, if you just sort of make the brain more plastic, that doesn't necessarily mean anything therapeutic is going to happen. You have to actually use that window of plasticity to build or unbuild something in the brain. And the plasticity is merely a permissive thing. It's not a directive thing, as you said. So I generally share that perspective. One of the things I wanted to ask you about too has to do with plasticity. And this will take me a minute to explain. And I don't think you're going to have an answer to it. But I want to get you talking about this in case you have any interesting ideas, or at least hear if you've heard what I have heard. So before I describe the anecdotal part, when we think about like drugs and plasticity, for people that don't have a background in this, in general, as a rule of thumb, something that is very short acting is sitting at the receptor for a short amount of time in the brain, and there is a small or very little plasticity that tends to be induced from that outlasts the actual drug. So for example, DMT is short acting. It doesn't sit at the receptor long. I would speculate that, mechanisms of cellular plasticity probably aren't as strong as you see with drugs like psilocybin and LSD. So if LSD, for example, is sitting in a receptor for hours and hours and hours, it's probably engaging cellular mechanisms that have that window of plasticity that outlast the drug for much longer than they would for something short acting like DMT, as a general rule of thumb. So that's the first thing I wanted to say by way of background. The second thing that I've observed and that I've been told anecdotally, which I think is very interesting, has to do with a difference between DMT and 5-MeO DMT. So I want to describe that and then maybe ask if you've seen anything akin to this in your studies. With DMT, you have these very vivid immersive experiences. They're very intense and short lasting. You can take the compound over and over again sequentially, and there isn't much adaptation to it, probably because it's not sitting at that receptor for a long time. And I've never heard anyone that I know who's had a DMT experience report what you might call a flashback or a reactivation. So no one that I've ever talked to has, done DMT and then come back the next day or the next week and say, oh my gosh, I was in yoga class or I was sleeping at night and I basically had another DMT experience in the absence of taking DMT again. With 5-MeO DMT, I have robustly observed that effect, where despite the fact that it's relatively short acting, although a little bit longer than DMT, and despite the fact that it's of comparable intensity perhaps, but a different quality, I've had many people report that they reactivate, meaning the next day or for a number of days after ingesting 5-MeO, they are having experiences that are, maybe not the full experience, but very, very close to that. And that would imply, if that is in fact a robust finding, and I don't think it's been studied scientifically or formally, but that would imply that 5-MeO DMT and DMT are having a different level of long-term plasticity induced. And having a compound that's short-acting, but also induces long-term plasticity is very interesting. And so I guess my question for you, besides just commenting generally on what you just heard, is have you observed in your studies with DMT any of your subjects reporting sort of dropping back into the experience in the absence of the drug after the study? My guess is you probably have not heard that a lot.
No, we have not. It has not happened that we have that, strong reactivation as some people get with 5-MeO DMT. But I think, I don't know how much the specifics of the pharmacokinetics or the pharmacodynamics have to do with that, in terms of how much the molecule is sitting in the receptor. Because it could have a direct relationship, but it could also be an indirect relationship, in the sense that it could be that 5-MeO DMT is acting on a central mechanism which is more prone to plasticity compared to NN-DMT. So these functional changes in the brain can be very impactful, and if they're impactful enough, they will, generate structural changes, which is what we refer to when we talk about plasticity. Structural change, the literal way that the shape of certain brain parts is shifted. I think it's very hard for me to give a straight answer, because we don't have data for that. Whether or not what differentiates that, it's how much the molecule sits at the receptor site. But I will say that whenever we speak about transformational effects with psychedelics, we speak about long-term effects that are there after the drug has left the system. And these transformational effects, at the psychological level, when we speak about that, we speak about mental health. We speak about changes in personality. We could think about also changes in beliefs. A big part of the work that I'm about to publish soon has to do with, how your metaphysical beliefs or how your beliefs about the nature of reality change after a single experience. And that can happen by an acute experience, an acute flash, similar to what happens when people have near-death experiences. They have a very significant experience that changes their outlook in life. And I think it's reasonable to argue that there could be also a plasticity correlate of that the brain also might change on some degree, on some level. So I'm not entirely sure whether or not the sitting at the receptor site is the key mechanism, but that's a hypothesis that could be tested in a lab.
Are there any other labs out there doing research on DMT or 5-MeO DMT right now? And if so, what are the basic questions that are being asked today?
I think there's more and more. I know that there's one in Basel, which is doing some, I think they're also doing some DMT extended infusions. I think the University of Yale is doing some experiments with DMT. They're more focused on, so the Basel people are probably more focused, I would presume, on basic pharmacological understandings, hormone levels, basic molecular mechanisms and so on. The people at Yale, I think, are more involved in consciousness research, similar to us to a certain extent. Apart from that, I don't know much of any. I know that there are also some actual the commercial endeavors to study DMT for therapeutic purposes.
Mm-hmm. So there is other research happening, but it's still relatively sparse.
Yeah.
And how did you actually get into this area to begin with? Did you start studying psychedelics and DMT in your postdoc, or were you already studying this in graduate school? How did you actually sort of journey into this research space?
So I'm a psychologist by training, very interested always in the human mind. I'm also from South America, specifically from Chile. In South America, there is an interesting relationship with psychoactive compounds and the history and the culture around it, and the way that it's still permeating to this day, influencing the culture. At least the interface between indigenous and Western cultures or traditions is a very interesting one, and it's a mix which is very much alive to this day. So I was always very interested in drugs, always very interested in how drugs change the mind and how drugs provide workings into the human minds and how it provides clues. The idea that you can manipulate mind through drugs, I find to this day very fascinating. There's a way to change our experience of reality through a very chemical sort of like nature, in a very nature-based biological way of understanding it. So it's a super interesting interface between mind and life, mind and matter. So I did my first degree in psychology. I then did my master's in neuroscience, and I did that when I was living in Italy. And when I was there, I found out about this conference here happening in London, which is called Breaking Convention. And that was in 2013. And I came to this conference and met my colleagues of today. And I did a PhD on it. And that's how I got in. Essentially, I went to a conference and found out all the amazing work that this was a time before Michael Pollan wrote his book. So this crazy wave that's happening now was kind of building up, but it certainly wasn't at the level that it is. So it was an interesting time in which it was still fairly underground, and it was rising, but it was discreetly rising. So
that book was that influential? You actually saw the effects in the research world?
Well, yeah. I mean, I was doing my PhD when that book came out. I did my PhD on DMT, so it was in my graduate work when I got straightforwardly into psychedelics, and it changed everything. Like it's 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 a cultural impact. Nowadays, you have retreat centers all around in many places of the world doing this semi-legally or completely legal, and many of their clients are newcomers, if you want, to the field who have read this book.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
For people that are interested in having an experience with a psychedelic like DMT or like psilocybin or something else, assuming that they have safe and legal access to it somewhere, wherever they might be interested in taking it, do you have any general advice beyond the generic advice that's sort of out there in popular culture for how people should prepare for these types of experiences, or whether or not how they should decide whether or not it might be appropriate for them?
From a harm reduction perspective, the usual sort of like advice is to one, inform very well about what might be going on, what could happen during an experience. Look into sites that provide good information about that. Harm reduction specific sites are good. So we have, for example, Drug Science here in the UK, which provides very good information on that. And then the next big advice, apart from information, is whatever sort of experience people are having, that they have it with somebody who knows what that experience is about and is a trustworthy person to do that with. Any sort of mechanism of accountability if something goes wrong, I think is important. And I think it's one of the positive things about legalization in some places, is that, facilitators need to be held accountable to a certain extent of what might go wrong, and if something goes wrong, So any sort of facilitator that will guide through that experience, that they have a screening process, so they make sure that you should or you should not have that experience, for example. Any facilitator who is very explicit about what can happen during a session, what cannot happen during a session. It's crucially important. Minimum of ethical standards. And that is what comes to mind at this point.
So anyone who's facilitating an experience like this that is not screening people in and out with some set of criteria, and who's not advertising potential adverse outcomes, that would be a red flag.
I would say, broadly speaking, yes. I think that the real crucial elements on the safety aspects of psychedelics, all the risks are psychological, but the real crucial element is the interpersonal element. Is who is guiding that session, who is providing a container for that experience, which can have challenging psychological moments to be dealt in the right way.
Mm-hmm. And before we let you get back to the lab, are there any final thoughts that you want to leave people with about this general area, or about your research and where it's going?
I think we're entering interesting times in which the use of psychedelics is becoming very mainstream. I think that might be an opportunity for change, for needed change on the way that we look at the world. We don't know if that will be the case. I think some people are hopeful of that. I would say in general that it's to remark that the use of classic psychedelics have a good safety profile in terms of physiological effects, but it's at the psychological level, at the level of experience, where things become a bit more tricky, a bit more nuanced. And I find that the better we are at developing cultural spaces, cultural devices, integration groups for people to have to talk about their experiences that might be challenging, generating instances for good, skillful guidance, the development of therapists and facilitators and so on, are all for the better, are the good things. I would say in general, the best way for people to approach this is to engage via community to these experiences, because it's this interpersonal factor which is so important for the outcomes to be safe and beneficial. So I would say, yeah, don't take it lightly. Take it with respect, and try to engage with it from many different levels, not just a simple level of pleasure or fun, but also maybe, intellectual level, trying to figure out what's happening, inform oneself about the experience, what are the risks behind the experience, and so on. So yeah, that would be my general message. Think about it with setting in mind, with context in mind, with history in mind.
All right. Well, Chris Timmermann, thank you for your time. Really appreciate it. I had a lot of fun talking to you, and have a good day.
Well, thank you, Nick, for having me.